Full reality is, in a world in which in order to afford to rent or buy a home, you need a second income, childcare becomes a very real component of it. We're actually seeing more and more households who are incapable of clearing that threshold for participation in the modern economy. The last 50 years has seen an extraordinary tax cut for the wealthiest Americans and an extraordinary tax hike for those in kind of the 20th to 80th percentile.
This is the core argument highlights using research from Michael Green. And once you understand how the poverty line was originally created, you start to see why millions of people feel like they're falling behind despite doing everything right. Please take a little time to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this. You can also check out our other videos on cryptocurrencies and the overall digital asset space, and drop your comments and observations in the comment section below. Everything you do helps with the YouTube algorithm and immensely contributes to the channel's growth. Thanks, and enjoy the video.
The simple reality is, in a world in which in order to afford to rent or buy a home, you need a second income, childcare becomes a very real component of it. We're actually seeing more and more households who are incapable of clearing that threshold for participation in the modern economy. The last 50 years has seen an extraordinary tax cut for the wealthiest Americans and an extraordinary tax hike for those in kind of the 20th to 80th percentile. Ignoring that is really at the core of the issue.
And that would mean millions of people who consider themselves to be middle class by the original definition and the original logic of the government are instead actually living in the modern day equivalent of poverty. Now, regardless of what you think about the actual number, it sparked a conversation, so full credit to Michael Green for sharing this. I'm gonna leave the article down below because it goes into way more interesting detail. Now, let me just sort of set the stage for how, when the poverty line was first created, it made sense for the world of that time. Why? Because it was a time when one person's income could support a family of four. And childcare costs weren't a thing because one parent stayed at home. And insurance costs were usually covered by their job. Incomes also kind of grew with inflation, and housing cost a fraction of what it does today. But instead of updating the formula as the economy changed, the government just sort of froze it in time. They never changed the core assumptions of what it meant to be poor once they defined it the way they did. They never added more categories like housing and healthcare. They did not want to adjust those spending ratios. Instead, what they did was they just adjusted the original number, which was roughly $3,000. And with inflation, every year they were like, let's just pump it up. Okay, that looks good enough. And that's why, if you ask the government today, what does it mean to be poor at the poverty line? They would tell you that number is about $31,000 a year. And because of that, this 1960s formula is what became the foundation for almost every major government policy around things like welfare and assistance programs and food stamps and school lunches, and even how we measure the success or the failure of the economy. And this is where the problem gets even crazier. Every major spending category that is our life today has completely flipped since the 1960s. Again, back then, food was the biggest household expense, and housing was pretty cheap. Today, food is one of our smallest expenses, and housing is the single biggest burden on most families. On top of that, healthcare costs have exploded. Childcare has become a full-time salary. Paying for insurance is now a mandatory thing. Everyone has to do it. Student debt has gotten out of control. And on top of all that, we have to pay more in taxes today than ever before. And none of this really existed in the original formula. Okay then, if all of that is true, then isn't that obvious? Why wouldn't the government update the old formula then, right? Well, it turns out they tried to, a lot of times. They tried to in the 70s, in the 80s, the 90s, and even the early 2000s. Economists called the poverty line inaccurate and outdated. But changing the formula turned out to be politically toxic Because if you update the poverty line to represent reality, that would then mean millions of more people would suddenly become poor on paper overnight. And if that were to happen, guess what the government would have to do? The government would be obligated to pay more assistance, spend more money, and acknowledge a very big economic crisis. And who wants to do that, right? And that brings us to the next question. If the old formula is broken, what would the poverty line be if we recalculated it using the same formula but with today's spending? So there's actually two different ways to think about this formula. The first way is the original Orshansky way, where she took the minimum cost of an essential thing, food, and divided it by the share of the household budget that it represented. And I know that kind of sounds confusing, so the easiest way to think about this is the essential thing multiplied by 3. Back then, food was the thing they used, and because food made up 33% of the family's budget, the multiplier was 3, because 33 multiplied by 3 gets us close to 100, which is the whole budget. All right, so the poverty line was basically the yearly food expense, which was $1,000 a year, multiplied by 3 equals $3,000. So if you made less than $3,000 in 1963, that meant you were at the poverty line. And that's what archives from the 60s show the poverty line actually was. Okay, today, food isn't anywhere close to a third of a family's spending, right? It's about 5 to 7%. And here's the part that seems really weird, but will make total sense to you. If food shrinks from 33% down to 6% of your budget, the multiplier does not stay at 3. It becomes 16. Wait, what? How, right? It's completely counterintuitive because most people think, okay, if food is 6% of my budget, I've got a lot left over. But that does not mean you have 94% left over for everything else. What it actually means is that everything, housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, all those other things have exploded relative to food. Food got smaller because the other essentials got bigger. That's why the ratio has to jump. So for example, let's say you spend $10,000 a year on food, and food happens to be 10% of your yearly budget. So 10% compared to everything else you spend money on. So 10 multiplied by 10 gets us to 100, your full budget. Make sense? That's why the multiplier is 10. Okay, so $10,000 multiplied by 10 gets us to $100,000. That's what this person has to make more than to be considered above the poverty line, according to Michael Green. Because relative to food, everything else would be more expensive.
When food shrinks as a percentage of your budget, it doesn't mean you have more money left over. It means other essentials have grown dramatically. So the multiplier doesn't stay at 3. It jumps to roughly 16. If a family spends $10,000 a year on food, and that represents about 6 to 10% of their budget, then 10,000 Cossacks 10, 16. 100,000, 160,000. That's not luxury. That's survival relative to modern costs.
Okay, Andrei, none of this makes sense to me. Try again. Right, so here's another example. Let's instead substitute food with another essential thing that is closer to what the 60s looked like. Now, food was a third back then. Now it's not. What takes up a third for us nowadays, for most people? Rent, right? Their mortgage. In some cases more than a third, but let's just use a third. So we know the multiplier, just like the 60s, is going to stay the same. It's going to be multiplied by 3. Okay, so let's say you pay the national average of $2,000 a month for your rent. That's $24,000 a year. Multiplied by 3, that would get us $72,000 a year to be above the poverty line. Michael Green argues if you don't make more than that and you pay that much for rent, that means you probably don't have much left over for everything else. Especially not much left over if you want to invest. That right there is the easiest way to say the government is wrong about $31,000 because today's poverty is much higher based on another essential thing that is today that is relative to the ratio of another thing back in the day. That's method number one. Now, method number two uses the modern update that Michael Green, which is I think even easier, and instead of relying on ratios, what you're doing is you're going to add up the actual cost of the things families cannot avoid paying for today. Because, unlike the 60s, you don't just pay for rent. You also have to pay for childcare, which they didn't have to do on one income. You also need transportation and food, healthcare, which at that time was taken care of by their employers. And once you add up conservative national average numbers for those categories, the way that Michael Green does this, you do not get $75,000. You end up needing a net income of around $118,000 just to cover the basics for a family of four. After you add in roughly $18,500 in federal, state, and FICA taxes, that brings you to a required gross income of around $136,500 a year. That is the modern day version of Molly Orshansky's too little threshold, the minimum needed to keep a family of four afloat in 2024. So to put this into perspective, the household median in the US today is about $80,000 a year. That's with two earners. But the moment both parents have to go to work, they trigger the $32,000 childcare bill because somebody has to watch the kids. The second worker then is not working to get ahead. They're working to pay the person watching their kids so that they can go to work. I think that might explain why so many young people are choosing not to have kids today. I can already see what some of the comments are gonna say. Well, I don't make $140,000 a year and I do just fine. And yes, obviously there's a lot of people that don't make $140,000 a year and still make it work. But this $140,000 number is not supposed to be luxury living. We're not factoring in, iPhones and vacations and Starbucks. The calculation includes three things: modest housing, basic healthcare, and bare minimum childcare if both parents work. That's it. There's no luxuries, there's no extras. Now, the second comment I can see people say is, well, not everyone wants to have kids. And that's true. But the original poverty formula was not created for singles. It was created for a household. In the 1960s, every poverty threshold assumed a family structure. And childcare back then was covered by a parent that stayed at home because they did not need a second income. Today, that role costs anywhere between $10,000 to $15,000 a year, conservatively. So if we're sticking to the original logic, childcare has to be included, which is also probably why people are choosing to have kids a lot later than ever before. Now, the third thing I can see people say is, well, just move somewhere cheaper.
If you're a young person and you can't afford to live here, then maybe you should not live here. I mean, that is a real thing. I know that we've now grown up in a society that says that you deserve to live where you grew up, but the reality is that the history of America is almost literally the opposite of that. The history of America is you go to a place where there is opportunity.
Now, here's reality. Even the cheapest states in the country now have a housing to income ratio that is historically very high. There's a national shortage of affordable housing, so moving across the country is not going to magically fix the whole economic system where the price of shelter has grown faster than income for decades. Now, another thing I can see people say is, well, healthcare shouldn't be included. That inflates the number. But in the 1960s, healthcare was only about 5% of a family's budget. Today, between premiums and deductibles and out-of-pocket costs, it can take up to 15 to 20% of your income. And it's not an optional thing. You have to have healthcare. If the original formula included the biggest essential expenses of its time, then the modern calculation has to do the same. Another thing people might say is, the $140,000 number is inflated by big coastal cities. But this calculation actually uses national medians, not New York or San Francisco. If you used only major cities like that, the poverty line would be way higher. And maybe the biggest objection I could see is, well, you're just changing the definition to push a specific narrative. But this is literally the government's original poverty formula that they use today. It's the same logic. It is the same math. The only thing that's changed is the modern reality that I'm plugging into it. If the economy evolves, but the formula doesn't, then it doesn't make sense anymore.
When millions of people who should count as struggling don't show up in the data, the system looks healthier than it is, and nothing changes. This isn't about pessimism. It's about accuracy, because you can't fix a problem you refuse to measure. And until we update how we define survival in a modern economy, the middle class will continue to disappear, quietly, statistically, and invisibly. Please take a little time to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications for more videos like this. You can also check out our other videos on cryptocurrencies and the overall digital asset space, and drop your comments and observations in the comment section below. Everything you do helps with the YouTube algorithm and immensely contributes to the channel's growth. Thanks, and enjoy the video.